Hello, Future Josh here. Just saying that I still have my letterbox. I keep forgetting to mention it at the start of every video, but I have a letterbox. And also, a few weeks ago, I was working on making a She-Hulk video where I reviewed every episode of She-Hulk, and I just gave up on the video, but I put a lot of work into the intro, so I think I'm just going to play that at the end of this video. Hello, my name is Josh. So the first one that I watched this month was Werewolf by Night. This felt like something very different from the MCU, and I really like the black and white style with some like small additions of colour like here and there, like the bloodstone is like red. I really like that. I haven't seen any of the like original like Universal monster movies, but I know this takes a lot of inspiration from those, and it does feel very old-timey and has a lot of old film qualities, which I can really appreciate. I like how it upped the blood and gore compared to other MCU properties as well. I guess they could get away with more since it's like black and white, and the horror elements all round were just really great as well. Obviously this was like a Marvel special presentation, and I would like to see it extended a little bit more to like a movie length, because I did feel like we missed out on a lot of character development and backstory that could have been expanded on that I just felt like we were missing. But overall, I think it's one of the best things that the MCU has put out this year, I think. I'll give it an 8.5. I'll forgive it. Does I need to be alone? And then I watched It. I actually watched Chapter 2 back in 2019 for some reason without watching the first film. From what I remember, there was a lot of jump scares in that film, and there was a lot of pointless and filler and a weird ending. But Chapter 1 was on Prime Video, and I really did want to watch this film, so I gave it a watch. Overall, I think it's a really effective horror movie. Obviously, Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise, it's just iconic. He just acts in a way that feels so like unsettling and uncanny valley in a way. Another big standout for me is the child actors. They just have so much chemistry in this film, and there's just so many like funny and entertaining scenes of them interacting. I think the third act of them taking down Pennywise was really satisfying, and I just feel like it leaves on a really great note. I do maybe think the movie is trying a little bit too hard to scare the audience. I didn't find this film that scary. Pennywise is very threatening and he's very unsettling, but I wouldn't call him straight up scary. And also, a lot of the jump scares in this film are extremely predictable. They just get a bit tiring after a point. So overall, I'd give this film an 8.5. And then I finished watching Bojack Horseman season 3. I think this is the best season so far of the show we got. I felt like they took a lot of risks in this season, and there's a lot of unique and different episodes to like the normal format of the show. The underwater episode with Bojack befriending this seahorse, the restaurant episode with Princess Carolyn, and the Sarah Lynn episode are just really big standouts for me in this season, and it gets really emotional and down to earth at points as well. And I love Bojack's character development throughout this season. It's just very, very solid season for me. I haven't really got that much complaints. I give it a 9.5. And then I watched A Nightmare on Elm Street. I mean, this is just a classic. I think Heather Langenkamp plays a great character in the form of Nancy Thompson. And I really like the supporting characters, especially Johnny Depp, which I think is like his first movie role. The concept is obviously really great, where like if you die in your dreams, you die in real life. And obviously Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger. He plays the role so mysteriously and in the shadows, which makes him all the more terrifying. All around, it's a classic slasher horror movie. Great ending. I just really like this film. I'd give it a 9.5. And then I watched A Nightmare on Elm Street 2: Freddy's Revenge. I think this is a very good follow-up with a very interesting concept, with Freddy using a human body to conduct his murders in real life. I do think the main character of Jesse is kind of weird. His actor is very clearly gay, but I feel like this film is really trying to force a straight relationship onto him, and it just felt very unnatural. The final act of this film was really fun though, with Freddy coming out into the real world and causing some carnage, and overall it was very enjoyable. I'd give it a 6. And then I finished watching She-Hulk Attorney at Law. It finally ended. It was pretty pretty bad. Most of the jokes didn't land for me. I just ended up finding the fourth wall breaking stuff very obnoxious. I know she did it in the comic books and that, but it just didn't translate well to the show. It felt extremely lazy in the final episode where they literally decided to break like the 16th wall. When I watched it, my mind was blown, but the more and more I started thinking about it, the more and more I realised how lazy it is. One thing I did end up liking was Tatiana Maslany as Jennifer though. I did find her very unlikable at first. She was a massive show-off in front of Bruce, but I did find her to have some really great character moments near the end of the show. But I do think a lot of her mannerisms and character personality is lost when she's in the She-Hulk form because of the pretty bad CGI. I do think the CGI improved. I do think She-Hulk looked pretty good on the final episode, but it still just has an uncanny valley feeling that Bruce Banner's Hulk doesn't have. I will say I did enjoy one episode, which was the penultimate episode with Daredevil, because obviously it has the return of Matt Murdock, and we also get some really great character development from Jen that is ultimately lost in the final episode for me. This show is just messy. The first half of the show I just couldn't stand, apart from Megan Thee Stallion, because it's Megan Thee Stallion, and the twerking scene was pretty nice to see. That sounds really... I'm not gonna lie, I did enjoy this show slightly better than Miss Marvel though. Miss Marvel did feel very extremely boring to me, and I didn't like any episode from that show, but with this show I did find at least one episode to be actually very enjoyable and good. So overall I give this show a 4.5 out of 10. And then I watched A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors. I really love this sequel. I think it's nearly as good as the original. It just has some really great 80s flair in this film. Obviously this film sees the return of Nancy, who helps our main characters kill Freddy. I also like the very 80s plotline of people having power in their dreams. It's just a very fun concept and leaves some really great deaths to the hands of Freddy. And there's also a lot of memorable lines and quotes said by Freddy in this film that I feel were missing from the last two films. Overall, this is a very fun film, very 80s, very enjoyable, like the kills. I'd give it a 9.5. And then I watched A Nightmare on Elm Street 4 The Dream Master. I think this film includes my favourite version of Freddy that I've seen. He just has some of the most creative and memorable kills in this film, and I just found his one-liners to be really great. I don't like the recasting of a lot of the main characters from the last film into this film, and I don't really like how they just killed off the main character from the last film halfway through this film. It just felt a bit of a disservice to the character, and they just kind of brushed over it and made this other girl the main lead. There is also a lot of stupid concepts in this film as well, like the girl obtaining other people's traits when they die to Freddy. Like, it just feels very weird. And I do find the final act to be the most forgettable out of all the films I've watched. But still, it is very 80s and we get a very great Robert Englund performance. I'd give it a 6.5. And then I skipped The Dream Child and Freddy's Dead because I have not heard very good things about those two films, and I went to Wes Craven's New Nightmare. I really love the concept of this film with the actors playing themselves, with Freddy like coming into the real world to terrorise Heather Langenkamp. There's some really good suspense built up in this film as well. And there's a proper like sense of dread that I felt was lacked in the last few films. Freddy does look a bit weird in this film, and he's just not as memorable as previous films. He doesn't have all the catchphrases and signature lines, but he does feel more in the shadows and like the scariest we've seen him since like the original. I actually like the child actor in this film. A lot of people don't like him. They find his acting to be pretty bad. I didn't really mind it that much. I think he did a surprisingly good job at being possessed. I love the ending as well, as like Heather's world slowly changes and becomes like the movie she acted in. I just really love this film. I think it's up there with Dream Warriors as one of my favourites. I think I'd give it another 9.5. And then I finished watching American Horror Story Freak Show. I watched Asylum back in September, and I said I was going to return back to this show after watching Asylum. This season looked like the most interesting season. It had a lot of well-known actors, and it had a very interesting concept with a freak show being introduced. So I was very intrigued. I gave it a watch and I really enjoyed it. Definitely not as good as Asylum, because Asylum was just phenomenal, but it still is a very well written season of television. I didn't realise at first that this show was like an anthology where the actors played different people each season. And I did find it a bit weird watching this season with everyone putting on like a different accent. But I did get used to it. Overall, I'm very mixed on Dandy as the villain, because on one hand he feels very cartoonishly snobby and just a proper brat. But over the season, it did kind of grow on me as a character, and I did like how psychotic he became, and he did start to become very threatening as a killer. I think the main problem with this show is just the deaths, mainly of like our main characters. When someone like important to the plot and we had like a lot of character development with dies, I feel like they just brush it off, and I don't think it's addressed properly. And I felt like a lot of the deaths are just deaths done for shock value. They just don't linger on the weight and emotion of those deaths, especially in the finale. I also think the pace of this show slowed down a lot near the middle, and I do think it focused on Dandy and his mental struggles a little bit too much in the middle half. I did want to see a bit more of the freaks. I also think some of the deaths in the show are a bit too early as well, especially with Tristy the Clown. He seemed like such a great and threatening villain with such a great backstory, and they just killed him off in the 4th episode. I do think it ended well though, and overall I do think it's very well written and acted. And we also get a bit of a cameo from the asylum, which I like to see. I would give it a 8. And then I watched Hellraiser. I really enjoyed this film. I think it's a really defining and just great horror film. I think the practical effects for this film are just phenomenal. It just has all the gore that I expect to see from this franchise. I do think maybe the 3rd act did go by a little fast, and I would like to see a little bit more fleshing out of the Cenobites. But apart from that, it's a general defining film. I don't really have much else to say about it. It's an 9.5. And then I watched the Solar Opposites Halloween special. I don't think it's called that. It's called something else, like Spectacular Halloween special. This is a 20-minute special. I'm not going to rate it, but I did have a fun time with it. It just fits well onto the end of season 3. Not all of the jokes landed for me like a lot of jokes in season 3. I do feel like it has a lot of problems that season 3 of Solar Opposites has. But I just like the Opposites hijinks, and some of the visuals, especially in Hell, look really great. And then I watched Hellbound Hellraiser 2. I really enjoyed the sequel. I think the practical effects of this film are just as good as the first. I've got some really great character development from Kirsty, who only really becomes the main character of the first film, like in the 3rd act. This actually reminds me a lot of Dream Warriors, with both of them being set in a psych ward, and it also features the protagonist of the first film returning. I do feel like a lot of the editing and special effects haven't aged as well as the first film though, and a lot of the effects actually got a laugh out of me for how bad they were. And I also think that like other girl who got introduced, who like doesn't speak at all, I feel like she was introduced a little bit too late into the story as well. It just felt like a bit of a lazy way to opening the doors to Hell. But overall, a very solid follow-up. I would give it a 8.5. And I watched Hellraiser 3 Hell on Earth. This film gets so weird and wacky. I just can't help but love it. I also like how this film delves into Pinhead's backstory, and I found like the pillar thing that they were stuck in for a chunk of this film to be like a really creative way of getting them back into the plot. I just didn't care for any of the main characters though, and some just did not have any chemistry with one another. Some characters didn't seem like they've acted in their life. I really changed my mind about this film though when the Cenobites killed everyone at the club and turned them into really creative Cenobites that were just really fun and really great. The 3rd act was just really great in my opinion, and I get that it loses some of the disturbing and serious nature of the first 2 films, but I can't not at least enjoy this a little bit. I'd give it a 7. And then I watched The Simpsons Not It. This is a Treehouse of Horror special. I did want to give it a watch because obviously I watched it earlier this month, and I did think this was actually a surprisingly very solid parody for a show that's been running for like over 30 years now. It's surprisingly well paced for like having to cram all of chapters 1 and 2 into like a 20-minute episode. I like seeing the young versions of everyone. I really like Krusty as Pennywise, and it leads to some really funny and creative moments based on what we previously knew about him from the show. Overall, it's just very fun special. I'm not going to rate it because it is a 20-minute episode once again, but very enjoyable special. And then I watched Hellraiser Inferno. This installment feels very much like the black sheep of the Hellraiser franchise. It has a very like detective noir style with the main character voicing over a lot of it, and there's also a lot of psychological thriller aspects to it which really make this film the second half for me. I really do like the new style and direction of this film, but with that being said, I do think there's a very big lack of Cenobites, especially with Pinhead, who has like a minute of screen time, and he's like the main thing on the poster. Pinhead is on it. He has like 1 minute of screen time in this whole film. That is false advertising. I also think the main character of this film does come across as very unlikable. He does some very bad things in like the first half of this film. He cheats on his wife. He frames his partner. It's just not that great. Overall though, I did like how dark this film got with its themes, and the conclusion was pretty great. Yeah, I'm very mixed on this film. Overall, I think I'll give it a 5.5. And then I watched Hellraiser 2022. I love how stylistic this reboot is. I think this film has some of the most interesting visuals of the whole franchise. I feel like the main characters of this installment are really well acted as well. I enjoy a different take in the Hellraiser lore, with people like having to bleed on the box for the Cenobites to come and kill you. I also like the stages and configurations of the box as well, and the temptation the main character feels for it. Obviously, the Cenobites aren't as iconic as the original, but they do come across as more frightening. They just have a very eerie atmosphere. My only complaint would be like the villain of this film, with like the nerve machine. His motives like just confuse me a bit, and he's just not that engaging. That being said, I do like where this film went with the finale and the final moment of the film. It's something that I've been wanting to see from the franchise, someone actually being turned into a Cenobite. Really love it. Really enjoyed this reboot overall. Not as iconic as original obviously, but still a very enjoyable film. I would give this an 8. And then I watched Jeepers Creepers. First of all, I know this film was directed by a next level nonce, but I just separated the art from the artist. Overall, I did have a fun time with it. I like the suspenseful nature of the first half and how it develops our two main leads. I like the very natural dialogue of the main characters, and the chemistry between these two actors seems to be really good. It really feels like a slow burn in the first half, with a lot of static shots that focus on the environment, but it didn't feel boring at any point. It just built a lot of suspense in my opinion. The second half is just a different story. Once the creeper kills those two police officers, the movie just decides to get as goofy as possible, with the two leads like hitting the creeper like 10 times with their car. They hit him with the car and the creeper goes like 80 feet in the air. Come on! Psychic introduced in this film did feel a bit weird, and I feel like the film kind of worked just fine without her, and the ending was a bit anticlimactic, with the creeper just kidnapping the teenager and just killing him. And I do feel like a film like this should have had more gore, but overall I had a good time with this film. I'd give it a 6. And then finished watching Doc Martin season 10. I have a lot of nostalgia with this show. My parents are big fans of it. I actually visited the place where this show was filmed, and I stood outside the Doc's house. I just think this is one of the best long running British TV shows. I watched season 9 when it came out, and I thought the ending of that season was the ending of the show, with like Martin resigning. They basically retconned it at the start of this season, with Martin just deciding to go back into being a doctor. A big complaint for me with this show is it does become a bit repetitive, and it's just very predictable. If you see someone with a knife in a scene, you know someone's going to get injured, because everyone in Port Wen is extremely clumsy for some reason. But I do feel like the season gets very unique at the end, with Martin wanting to move to London for another job. I love the conflict this creates with all of the characters, and the final episode I really loved. I think it's a great send-off. It has a lot of stakes, with the Doc not saving the day, instead getting injured himself, and it just shows some great acting from Caroline Katz. Overall, this season comes to a very satisfying conclusion. It's very heartwarming, and you actually see the Doc smile for like the first time in the whole span of the show, which is just very weird. Overall, I'd give this season a solid 8. And then I watched Bojack Horseman season 4. I don't like the season as much as the last, due to all of the unique styles and themes of the previous season, but this is still really close. I like the introduction of Bojack's daughter and the responsibility he feels over her. The real focus on Bojack's backstory and family history in this season is really great as well, especially in the penultimate episode, which shows Bojack's mother struggling to remember her past as she suffers from dementia. It just leads to some really emotional moments. I like how this season takes the time to focus on our supporting characters as well, sometimes even more than Bojack, and it just gives them some really great character development, especially Princess Carolyn and Diane. Overall, it's a slightly more streamlined, but still amazing season of the show. I'd give it a 9. And then what's another Simpsons Treehouse horror special, Treehouse Horror 33. I decided to watch this episode after seeing the preview images, and it's like a parody of Death Note, which I really need to get on it. I've heard it's a really great anime, but the animation actually looked pretty good, and I was very intrigued, so I gave it a watch. And I think this is a very solid Treehouse of Horror. The Babadook parody was really fun, but I just can't get over the deterioration of Marge's voice over the years, and it's really evident in this. The Death Note parody was obviously really great, and it has some really great animations mentioned, and the Simpson Land segment was probably my favourite, to be honest, because it referenced a lot of classic Simpsons episodes and had a very fun twist at the end. So overall, surprisingly very good Treehouse of Horror episode. And then I watched The Conjuring. I actually watched these last 3 films after Halloween. I was running out of time, but I think this film is just one of the most unique and visually interesting horror movies I've seen. There are these like shots that like zoom in or like tilt the camera to build like a lot of tension. I really love it for that. I love the Warrens as characters, and when they eventually enter the house, it just feels way more safe and comforting. I do feel like their characters could have been a little bit more fleshed out though. This film was obviously iconic for its scares, and I do see why, because they're very unique and they don't feel cheap, and the tension built up to them is really great as well. This film gets very crazy at the end, with the mother getting possessed and chairs shooting across the room and a gun firing, and I did have a lot of fun with that. There were a few moments that had a bit of like goofy editing and maybe didn't work with the tone of the film, but that's James Wan for you. I've watched Aquaman, so I know how goofy you can get. Overall, this is just an amazingly well made film, very well paced. I'd give it a 9. Yeah. And then I watched The Conjuring 2. I really think this is a really great follow up that upped the scares, meaning that I had to check where'sthejump.com because of my scaredy cat. I think there's a lot more character development from the Warrens, which I like to see. Like the first film, the third act just evolved into goofy editing and objects launching across the room, which I really like from this franchise. It just reminds you that James Wan directed this. Obviously, this film is primarily set in Britain, and maybe there is a bit of stereotype for some of the characters, and Britain is not that dark as well. Like the colour grading compared to like the America scenes, like Britain is not that dark. I love the new demons introduced in this film, like the nun and the crooked man. They're just very scary, they look really cool. I just had a lot of suspense to the film. They're very iconic as well, and overall this film has a surprisingly heartwarming conclusion. I'd give it an 8.5. And then finally this month I watched Annabelle creation. I like how this film delves into the creation of this iconic doll, which we saw in the first Conjuring film. I feel like the jump scares were upped even more for this film, yet none of them felt cheap. Whilst the first 2 Conjuring films focused on the families, this film focused obviously more on the orphans, and they did get on my nerves a bit during this film. They're just giggling all the time. I love the whole devil aspect to this film. It looks so cool. He's up there with the nun and the crooked man from Conjuring 2, but I do wish we got to see a little bit more of him. I do think this film was lacking that James Wan flair that we saw from the first 2 Conjuring films. There was some chair flying action at the end, but it just didn't feel the same. I do feel like this is a bit of a step down, but overall this is still a really solid film that has the scares, that has the moments that you want to see from a horror film like this. I'd give it a 7. So those are all of the films and TV shows I've watched in the month of October. I'm currently watching Rick and Morty season 6. This had like a hiatus at the start of October, so I haven't really got anything new to say about this season until the season resumes in November. I'm also still watching Andor. I'm still finding this show boring, unfortunately, but it has grown on me in the past few episodes. I'm really intrigued now that Cassian has gone to jail, and I'm interested to see how that goes from there. And finally, I'm watching Bojack Horseman season 5. Still, obviously, I'm loving this show. Just love to see the character development and everything from one of these characters, see where this show goes next. Really excited to see where it goes next. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. If you didn't, please leave a dislike. And the MCU, more than a decade's worth of amazing storytelling and build-up from a variety of different directors spanning over 3 phases, culminating in the epic finale Avengers Endgame, and nothing else happened after that. No, nothing. Now me personally, I've been an MCU fan for around 2 years now. Around lockdown time in 2020, I took it upon myself to watch every single MCU related property, and overall, I pretty much enjoyed all of them, maybe except Captain Marvel because women are bad. And then by the time phase 4 was around, I was hyped and I was excited. I have great nostalgia of WandaVision, like me getting up and watching WandaVision every Wednesday morning before going on Microsoft Teams and doing my online lessons. Falcon and the Winter Soldier came round, all around, enjoyed that. Black Widow came round, decent. Overall, I was enjoying what phase 4 had to offer. Then 2022 rolled round. Doctor Strange was great, but slightly disappointing considering the cameos teased. Moon Knight seemed like it was going to be phase 4's best, before having a pretty mediocre finale. Thor Love and Thunder was very disappointing considering like the masterpiece that was the last Thor film. And then we get to Miss Marvel, which is where my love of the MCU started to wobble a bit. I have expressed my dislike for this show in my end of month video where I said I found the characters being likeable, the writing to be awkward, and the plot to be rushed and just boring. Around the release of this show, former workers on the Marvel CGI team came out saying that they were overworked and they didn't have time to finish a lot of the shots on these films and TV shows, which became more and more evident with a lot of faithful films. Today, it just seems like the norm to hate on the MCU because of a lot of these reasons, and Marvel's latest show, She-Hulk Attorney at Law, definitely does not help with that. Finally, I got to the subject of today's video.